Thank you very much, Helen, and really nice to have a chance to talk about what is, in many ways, one of my favourite agreements that New Zealand's been involved in. But first of all, a really warm welcome to colleagues and thank you for joining. I know that in Geneva, a 9 o'clock meeting is always a bit difficult. I recall that from my own time in Geneva. But look, what I thought I would do is provide a bit of the background of how we got to the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, because it has its roots in something that is more than a decade ago that we started, and I can see some colleagues that are online were present at the creation, if you like. So the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability is, a set of rules. It's a rule book, not a playbook. It's a rule book that does three significant things. It does the classical trade thing, eliminates tariffs, schedules for services, so very orthodox in a sense. It is not so orthodox in the sense that it is a very long list, that we have something called the living list in it, and that we've expanded the definition of what an environmental service is. But nevertheless, that is a fairly classical trade response to the challenge we face. The second thing that we've done is we've looked at eco-labels, and I think the thing that I would encourage colleagues to look at is read the text carefully, because it is very interesting indeed what we try to do here. Because what we've tried to do is create a mechanism that sheds light. It's kind of the Dracula effect, if you like, sunlight on things and you hope that they wither away and die. We're looking to shed light not just on state driven eco-labeling programs, labeling and certification requirements, but also on those of non-state actors. And this goes to the monopsony effects that we observe from supermarkets and other actors in the market, who then create these one-size-fits-all labeling programs. And what we wanted to do is have a mechanism by which we could check in, and that there will be some obligations on partners to try to ensure that the guidelines that we'd agreed, which are, truth in advertising, non-discrimination, consultative, sort of the, again, classical trade elements, that those would be promoted to those non-state actors, and that there would be some way of checking in on those particular programs where another partner might feel that they were being discriminated against, or didn't think that the label was perhaps as truthful as it should be in terms of its environmental effectiveness. So it's a kind of a norm-building element of the agreement. But perhaps the most significant thing, and that is where the origin of this agreement really comes from, is the work that we did around fossil fuel subsidy here. Now, this work dates back quite a long way, several decades, in fact, but perhaps its starting point really was in 2010, when a group called the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform was first launched. At that time, it was just two countries, New Zealand and Sweden, and together we had been looking around, and it was created in the margins of the CTESS and in the margins of the Joint Working Party on Trade and Environment at the OECD, and we'd been observing as small states that the G7, the G20, and even APEC leaders had been saying that they wanted to reform fossil fuel subsidies, and they kept saying it year after year. So since 2008. They kept saying that. And we took them at their word, and we thought, well, as small states and medium-sized states like Switzerland, we thought what we would do is we would support that work. So during the French presidency, for example, we were very active as a group in encouraging France to develop the concept, for example, of peer reviews. And I see Peter is here. Ron Steenblick, who may be known to many of you as well, were part of something called a very important initiative at the time called the Global Subsidies Initiative, that helped us set up, or they built the first data set that helped us understand the extent of subsidization, the impacts that it was having, and gave us a time series on which we could really reflect on and see the startling numbers that are out there. In 2022, for example, the OECD, of course, has said that there were $1.6 trillion worth of fossil fuel subsidies. Way back when we started this initiative, back with the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, it was less than $1 billion. I apologize for my dog. So back then we we had a series of efforts sort of to build norms, to engage with the G7, to engage with the G20, peer reviews. New Zealand submitted to a peer review. A number of other economies also worked on peer reviews, and that was designed to help us understand where reform might need to be targeted, where the biggest distortions lay, and also to give us a chance to reflect on whether this was the best way to be spending taxpayer money. The problem was, though, that as we expanded our group, so more countries joined the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, we also saw that year after year, the G7 and the G20 and the APEC economic leaders would piously say each year that, yes, they did want to do reform, and each year fossil fuel subsidization continued to grow. So then we decided in 2015 that we needed to be a bit more active. We needed to do something about that. And in particular, what we decided to do was a joint ministerial statement. Our Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister John Key, launched that statement at one of the COPs. So this was our climate change focused element. But at the same time, those of us on the trade side of the shop thought to ourselves, we also need to do something on the trade track. So we gradually started to build a community within the World Trade Organization of like-minded countries that were concerned about this, obviously built around the Friends grouping, the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. That grouping then emerged in 2017 at MC11 in Buenos Aires with the first WTO ministerial statement on fossil fuel subsidy reform. When I say ministerial statement, I mean, of course, 12 WTO members signed on to that statement. So we were, as you can see, incrementally looking to build the concept, to raise awareness, to increase a bit of transparency around this, supporting and continuing to support the work that the Global Subsidies Initiative was doing, as well as the work that was happening in parallel at the OECD and the IEA. And in 2021, we managed to expand that. Another joint ministerial statement emerged at the World Trade Organization with 44 members. In 2022 at MC12, it rose to 46 members. At the most recent ministerial in Abu Dhabi, we got to, I believe, 47, counting the EU as 27 member states. So again, looking to grow this. But it's fair to say that there was a certain amount of impatience among some of us. We did feel that we were in a challenging spot because we were not fundamentally making much progress. We were seeing the subsidization increasing. We were seeing fitful references. So they weren't happening every year as we'd hoped. And sadly, the references felt that they were getting weaker and weaker. So you're all familiar with the language, the reform of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which is a wonderfully ambiguous term. So it was in that context, particularly when we went around G7 and G20 capitals, that we thought to ourselves as a group, we really needed to do something more than build norms. We needed to now take the plunge and actually convert the norms that we were building and thinking about into actual rules. And that is the genesis of the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. And it's driven by the sense that trade does need to be part of the solution here. It does need to be one of the tools in the toolbox to address climate change. None of us in the agreement pretend that it is going to solve climate change. What we do know is that fossil fuel subsidy reform, their elimination, would make a fundamental difference to the way in which we are looking at the challenge that's in front of us. So the IPCC tells us that you need a 43% cut in emissions by 2030 to get us within range of at that target. 10% is where you could get the cut in terms of fossil fuel subsidies. To put it another way, this is work that the EU has done in the Joint Research Centre. They've estimated that the elimination of all fossil fuel subsidies would be the equivalent of 165 countries stopping all emissions altogether. So this does matter. So I did want to give you a bit of the history of this, but I now want to talk a little bit about the outlook for it. So yes, indeed, it is the case that it is for small states, and Switzerland indeed is a medium-sized economy, of course, but nevertheless, my point remains that we are minor contributors to the global challenge in front of us. But the concept of what we have is something that New Zealand calls open plurilateralism. This is the idea that these agreements need to be building blocks. They need to support the World Trade Organization, the International Rules-Based Trading System, and in particular, they need to be those building blocks that Bhagwati talks about, not stumbling blocks. So in particular, we wanted an agreement that would be WTO plus. That was pretty easy because there is no outcome on in the WTO, unfortunately, not even on environmental goods. We also wanted this to be closely aligned. So we did take significant steps to ensure that we were transparent with what we were doing. We reported regularly into committees in Geneva at the WTO. We engaged in substantial outreach, all of us, to explain what the vision was and what we were trying to do. And then essentially what we've done is and I know colleagues will talk about this in much more detail, what we've done is we, for the first time, have been able to define in a trade agreement what is a fossil fuel subsidy. We've been able to make some serious commitments, prohibition, for example, of coal subsidies, put in a standstill requirement. So a whole set of disciplines that actually do bite. And as we look out, what we want this open plurilateral to do is to attract other members, other WTO members, to say, we need to be part of this. This is going to help us drive our own domestic reform agenda. And by the way, it will connect the rhetoric, this lofty rhetoric that we've been having since 2007, 2008, to real world actions. And in a sense, that is what we are going to be doing when we go out with this agreement. We'll be saying to colleagues, this is an open accession agreement. If you can meet the standards that we've set in this agreement, if you can make the commitments that we've laid out here, you are welcome to join. In fact, the question that I would pose to colleagues is, tell us why you can't be part of this. Because what this agreement does is what we did for agriculture way back in 1995. In the same way that the efforts to reform agriculture internationally simply did not deliver, it required the WTO agreement on agriculture to strike at the heart of agriculture and drive meaningful reform. Some of us, of course, don't think we're quite there yet, but nevertheless, it was certainly a very strong start. And this agreement is in the same spirit of that agreement back in 1995. It's designed to get us started, and it's designed to ask people the question, tell us why your leader can sign on to the G7, the G20, the Sustainable Development Goals, but you are not able to actually do meaningful reform in this legally binding, enforceable trade agreement. And that, colleagues, is the question that I want to leave you with today, I should say, in Geneva. Lovely to see you all. Caroline, thank you.
Thank you so much, Vangelis, for that great introduction. For those of you who don't know Vangelis, he's the Deputy Secretary of Trade and Economy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of New Zealand. And he's really been, as you can see here, the top negotiator for New Zealand for the conclusion of ACS, and really a driver and an engine really for moving not only ACS forward, but some of this critical work that New Zealand's been leading around fossil fuel subsidies reform and so on. So we're really delighted to have had you provide that perspective this morning, Vangelis, and thank you for your leadership and your continuing commitment to moving these issues forward, despite the frustration and how long some of it is taking. I think we can all be grateful to you and congratulate you and all of your colleagues on concluding this agreement. So on behalf of TESS, I'm also delighted to welcome our speakers and guests today to this webinar. We're really delighted to co-host it with New Zealand, Costa Rica, Iceland, and Switzerland. For those of you who don't know TESS, our work is very much focused on promoting inclusive cooperation at the nexus of trade, environment, and sustainable development. And a major focus of that work is on fostering cooperation on a trading system that responds effectively to the climate crisis. And as ACS is the first agreement, even if among smaller, medium-sized trading nations that really directly tries to address climate issues, we felt it's really imperative to promote dialogue and conversation about this. There's been a great deal of interest in this from stakeholders and experts since it was first launched, with many very optimistic about its role as a pathfinder initiative. So what we're going to have for the remainder of our webinar today is an opportunity to hear from some of the lead negotiators involved in the process, who'll provide a snapshot of the main provisions. Vangelis provided us an overarching sort of sense of the 4 pillars and where he sees that there has been advances, but we'll have a chance to hear a bit more in depth. And then we'll hear from a group of quite a diverse group of different stakeholders and experts, their reflections about the significance of the agreement, where to build from here, and also how it fits into the wider landscape. Because one of the things that's happened, I think, since ACTS was launched is that the landscape of debate and policies and measures that governments are taking around climate and clade has really evolved significantly. The issues that ACTS addresses remain at the core of that discussion, but there are a range of other policy debates that are there. So I think it's useful to put ACTS in context a little bit and see how it can inform wider efforts to bolster cooperation on trade and climate. So with that sort of brief introduction, I want to turn swiftly to our 4 panelists from the 4 governments. So welcome Thomas Roth, who's the Deputy Head of the WTO Division at Switzerland's State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. We then have Anna Lizano, who's Councillor at the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the WTO. Michelle Slade, who's Principal Trade Advisor at the Permanent Mission of New Zealand to the WTO. And then Ogmundur Magnusson, who's a Councillor and Deputy Permanent Representative to EFTA at the Embassy of Iceland in Geneva. We're really delighted to have the 4 of you. And then what I'll do is I'll save the introduction for our experts until after we've heard from that panel. But we'll have about 15 or so minutes from the 4 countries themselves to present in a little bit more depth. And then we'll really dive into some reflections and perspectives from some of the experts and stakeholders, and hope to have time for some questions at the end. For those who do have questions, I'd invite you to put them in the chat so that I can filter those and we can feed them back to our representatives of the governments. But just before I turn to the governments to speak, I just wanted to thank again Vangelis. I know it's late at night there in New Zealand, so if you have to leave, we will farewell you when you're ready to. But really thank you again for being such a force behind moving this work forward. So with that, I will turn firstly to Thomas to please lead the way on the presentation. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I hope you can hear me well. Apologies for the issues I had at the beginning. First, let me thank you very much, TESS, for organizing and co-hosting this event. It is an honor to have the opportunity now to present ACTS at this event with such a distinguished panel that will comment afterwards. After the years of intensive negotiations, it's now really exciting to be able to present this agreement and to hear comments from the various stakeholders. Over the next 15 minutes, we will be pleased to give you an overview and explain the most important elements of this agreement. And we will do this together with my co-speakers, and we will take you through this agreement chapter by chapter. In order to start, we have first slide on origin and purpose of the agreement, but here I can be really brief. So it's the slide on page 2 or 3. I don't know whether I have to move to this, but just to start, I can be very brief on this because Vangelis already explained very well the origin of this agreement and its purpose. What I would like to add here is that currently in our respective governments, the processes for ratification are ongoing, and we expect the agreement to enter into force either late 2025 or 2026. On the objectives and action areas, the agreement has the objective of fostering the contribution of international trade to help address climate change and other serious environmental challenges, such as loss of biodiversity or pollution, and thereby contributing to sustainable development. And it does it in 4 key areas. As I already explained at the beginning here by Vangelis, it's about removing tariffs of environmental goods, promoting commitments for environmental and environmentally related services, disciplining and eliminating harmful fossil fuel subsidies, and providing guidelines for voluntary eco-labeling programs. Now moving to the first part of the agreement, and that includes initial and general provisions. That's on the next slide. In this opening section of the acts, there are horizontal provisions that include provisions related to the interaction with other agreements, transparency, cooperation in international fora, or balance of payments provisions that are familiar also in other trade agreements. So these are the initial part. I'm not sure whether I can't see the slides, but I propose that we move on now to the substantial part of the agreement, and we start with the first substantive chapter that's about the environmental goods. And for that, I hand over the floor to Anna to present this chapter. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Thomas, and also thank you to TESS for having us. And it is an honor to be here representing the government of Costa Rica and to come after Vangelis, which is also an honor to be in the same panel with you and Thomas and my colleagues from the ACTS agreement. If we can go to the slide on environmental goods, please. Thank you. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. So in the environmental goods chapter, the ACTS parties agreed to eliminate import duties on a list of over 300 environmental goods. These have been identified on the basis that they substantially contribute to environmental and climate change goals. So there's a criteria for these goals. And first, let me describe them. The goals include climate change adaptation and mitigation, pollution prevention and control, sustainable use, protection, or restoration of natural resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, the transition to a circular economy, and the sustainable development objectives of the parties or other wider environmental goals. This list of environmental goods is not intended to include goods which significantly harm any of the purposes that I just mentioned, and it is also intended to be reviewed regularly with a view to updating it. Can we go to the next slide, please? In terms of conservation and sustainable management, the environmental goods chapter has a specific article on it relevant to the production of environmental goods, rather. It contains in Article 2.4 a specificity covering this issue. It includes provisions promoting trade, ensuring transparency of domestic policies and measures, encouraging transparency of domestic policies, cooperation, and engaging in discussions on possible equivalence systems to recognize sustainably produced environmental goods. Specifically, in relation to wood, the ACTS parties agreed to give positive consideration to equivalence requests, even if other parties' measures differ from their own, to the extent consistent with the international obligations and domestic laws and regulations. Then, in Article 2.4.2 of this same chapter, it is confirmed a general right to regulate in accordance with international obligations in order to achieve legitimate objectives in relation to all environmental goods. In this regard, there is also a provision specific to wood products, which would permit a party to delay tariff elimination on wood products for up to 18 months following entry into force of this agreement for that party. This may also be extended by an additional 18 months if necessary, and any delay of this kind should be notified to the other parties of the agreement. Next slide, please. Then the temporary special mechanism is it is encouraged actually to increase the participation of WTO members in this agreement as an open plurilateral, as previously mentioned. It includes flexibility mechanisms to defer the elimination of tariffs on a limited number of environmental goods. This would enable a new party of the acts to postpone the elimination of import duties on a limited set of goods at the time it accedes to the agreement, provided it specifies these goods and this is agreed as part of its accession process. If new items are added to the list of environmental goods as a living list, as mentioned earlier, there is a provision to enable the Joint Commission to indicate which of these new items, if any, a party might be able to postpone elimination of import duties to. The temporary postponement of the elimination of import duties of an environmental good is only available for a finite period of 12 years from the date of entry into force of the agreement, with the number of items in the environmental goods list able to be postponed restricted to a maximum of 8% of items for up to 6 years, then dropping to 4% of items for any further years pending until the 12-year period expires. Further, there is an anti-concentration clause, which means that a party is not able to postpone the elimination of import duties on more than half of environmental goods in any single harmonized system chapter, with any case of postponement of elimination of import duties of more than one environmental good. These goods cannot be selected from any one harmonized system chapter exclusively. Next slide, please. To conclude the environmental goods chapter, the Acts incorporates the general exceptions of Article 20 of GATT 94. This includes environmental measures necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, and measures relating to the conservation of living and non-living exhaustible natural resources. The agreement also establishes a subcommittee on trade in environmental goods that will consider any matter related to this chapter. This subcommittee also is required to meet within 18 months of the entry into force of the agreement and as required thereafter. Finally, proposals for new goods to be added to the list will need to be accompanied by justification of their environmental benefits and reference to their environmental purposes. With this, I conclude a very general overview of the environmental goods chapter and pass the floor to my colleague, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna. Kia ora tātou, good morning, Carolyn, TESS colleagues. Thank you very much for hosting this webinar, and lovely to see so many trade and environment colleagues online. Turning to environmental services, if I could have the first slide, please. The Environmental Services chapter seeks to promote the liberalisation of trade in environmental and environmentally related services. It defines environmental and environmentally related services as those that contribute substantially to the environmental goals outlined in the chapter's objectives and have the primary purpose or have a direct relationship with one of the environmental purposes listed in Annex 3. So a similar approach to relating the specific commitments to environmental purposes that is in the environmental goods chapter as well. So Annex 3 of the Environmental Services chapter sets out these environmental purposes and groups them under 3 headings: environmental protection purposes, resource management purposes, and climate change adaptation and mitigation purposes. Then Annex 4 of the chapter translates that into the specific 114 environmental and environmentally related services that are identified as substantially contributing to addressing these environmental purposes. In some cases, it includes some horizontal X-outs to exclude any part of a sector or subsector that may significantly harm one or more of the environmental purposes set out in Annex 3. So this has elaborated a substantial list of environmental and environmentally related services against which, if I could have the next slide, please, against which the parties have made their commitments. So the Environmental Services chapter contains the usual General Agreement on Trade and Services, WTO GATS, obligations in respect of market access and national treatment. It also contains provisions on domestic regulation, payments and transfers, and these are familiar from a GATS context. Similar to GATS, it does not apply to government procurement, but based on this relatively extensive list of environmental services and environmentally related services, parties have made their commitments. The chapter also contains an opportunity for review with that list of environmental and environmentally related services able to be reviewed and added to with proposals made by members either individually or jointly. Thank you. That's a brief introduction of the environmental services side, and I'll turn to Thomas to talk about fossil fuel subsidies.
Yes, thank you very much, Michelle. Yes, I'm pleased to explain some of the important parts of this fossil fuel subsidies chapter in the agreement. To our knowledge, it establishes the first legally binding framework to discipline and eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies, and contains the first definition of a fossil fuel subsidy in a trade agreement. First, it defines what exactly qualifies as a fossil fuel for the purposes of this chapter. Fossil fuels are, on the one hand, goods that are derived from remains of ancient plant and animal life. That's a list of goods in the Annex 7. It includes what we commonly know as fossil fuels, coal or petrol and diesel and other goods. And secondly, it includes energy products such as electricity and hydrogen when derived from fossil fuels and going above the defined emissions intensity levels. And this is included in Annex 8 of the agreement. Using the CO2 emission levels as a measure that ensures that energy products primarily generated through renewable or clean alternatives are not inadvertently captured by the chapter obligations. The chapter does not encompass subsidies to the consumption of such derived energy products, and it does not encompass subsidies to other products derived from fossil fuels that are not used as a source of energy, like, for example, plastics or fertilizers. Now, coming to the definition, the subsidy definition builds on the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, ASCM, taking over the elements of financial contribution and income or price support. These elements include financial contributions in the form of revenue foregone and consequently also tax expenditure measures. To take into account the harmful environmental effects of the subsidies, the ASCM specificity requirement is not included in Acts. Instead, the definition identifies how the benefit from financial contribution or income or price support must be conferred. The notion benefit is defined separately for 3 different types of subsidies. First, for production subsidies to fossil fuels. Second, production subsidies to fossil fuel energy products that I mentioned before, such as electricity. And third, consumption subsidies to fossil fuels. And speaking about consumption subsidies to fossil fuels, this involves a new mechanism that is introduced in this chapter. It's the SCRM mechanism, the standardized carbon rate measurement mechanism. That's on the next slide. Yes, thank you. This mechanism is designed to align high energy taxes or carbon pricing policies with the chapter's discipline. A party using this mechanism can set, in line with its climate policy, a threshold for the price of CO2 in its economy. If a financial contribution or income or price support causes the domestic price of carbon to go under that threshold, such as a tax rebate for a certain sector, those measures are deemed a fossil fuel subsidy to the extent it falls under this threshold. As a result, financial contribution or income or price support that lower the carbon price without falling below this threshold are not considered subsidies. However, they are still subject to transparency obligations. Now coming to the obligations, and on the next slide, first it's about prohibited subsidies. The fossil fuel subsidies chapter contains a list of prohibited fossil fuel subsidies. These are set out in Annex 9 to the agreement, and it includes subsidies to coal or to the production of oil and gas. And Acts restricts the introduction of new fossil fuel subsidies with some remaining possibilities related to a de minimis provision or to the specific exceptions I will come back later to. Then there is a chapter on an article on scheduled subsidies. That's on the next slide. Parties are permitted to schedule existing but not prohibited subsidies under this agreement. These subsidies, the scheduled subsidies, are subject to a standstill commitment. Now coming to the exceptions, the chapter has a specific exceptions article. That's on the next slide. Yeah, thank you. And that permits parties to introduce or maintain subsidies that contribute significantly to one of a set of listed policy goals. In the interest of time, I do not go through this, the list of these policy goals, but it includes important policy goals that prevail those other commitments. Then the chapter includes also some other provisions I would like to quickly mention here. That's on the next slide. It includes an article on cooperation, on capacity building, transparency, so with comprehensive notification obligations, and an article on review. So this ends my explanations of this subsidy chapter, and I would like to hand over the floor to Mundur for the last substantive chapter on eco-labeling.
Yeah, sorry. Good morning, everybody, and good evening to you, Vangelis, and those on the other side of the world. So I'm Ögmundur. I'm here representing Iceland. Happy to be here. As Vangelis has already touched upon eco-labeling, I will keep this very short if I can get the next slide. So what the chapter on eco-labeling does is to set guidelines to aid in the development of those voluntary eco-labeling programs. The ultimate goal is to build consumer confidence for those programs that are set out as being, truthful, reliable, verifiable, and so on. As these are guidelines, they are not legally binding. but the chapter, what it seeks to do is to promote good regulatory practice. Next slide, please. So to support in the implementation of the guidelines, the parties designate national contact points that their role is to promote the guidelines, respond to inquiries, report on and exchange experience on actions taken under the guidelines. So as I noted, this is all voluntary and not legally binding, so it's not subject to dispute settlement. But as noted there on the slide, the chapter still provides for consultations between the parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ogmundur. I'm happy to conclude this presentation with some final remarks on the additional chapters that are included in the agreement, and on some final remarks. So it includes also a chapter on dispute settlement. This chapter outlines the procedure that apply to a formal settlement of disputes under this agreement. It encourages parties to undertake alternative dispute resolution processes rather than escalation to formal disputes. If there is a need, a formation of an arbitration panel can be requested. And should an arbitration panel final report not be implemented, the chapter provides for voluntary compensation measures linked to the objectives of the agreement for a temporary period until the non-compliant measure is withdrawn or amended. In the absence of compensation, a suite of institutional measure is available to including non-eligibility to chair bodies, the possibility to suspend incorporation, regular scrutiny by the Joint Commission, naming and shaming, and other further measures agreed by the Joint Commission. What is important, however, is that no countermeasures are envisaged under this agreement, as this would run contrary to the objectives of the agreement. If, for example, introducing tariffs on environmental goods, this would not be in line with the objectives of the agreement. The chapter includes institutional provisions, including a joint commission and relevant subcommittees to monitor and support the function of the agreement. So this concludes the overview of the content of this agreement, and I have a few remaining remarks against the background of these beautiful mountains we have in front of us from New Zealand. So the ACTS parties have been mindful throughout the negotiations of the importance of the consistency with the WTO requirements. For example, the liberalization of tariffs on environmental goods and the rules on environmental services will be implemented on a non-discriminatory basis, so all WTO members will benefit. This way, the ACTS serves to support the rules-based multilateral trading system. Following the entry into force, ACTS is open to accession by WTO members, as it was mentioned before, that meet the level of the ambition of the agreement as a whole. It is not possible to accede to only part of the agreement. ACTS has also a deliberate object of complementing and stimulating work at the WTO. The provisions developed in the agreement may serve as inputs to multilateral work, as they present possible ways forward on various issues at the interface of trade and environmental topics at the WTO. As a final remark, in announcing the conclusion of the agreement in July, the ACTS ministers were clear that while we are a small group now, our ambition is for the ACTS to rapidly increase its membership and to be a pathfinder agreement that will drive momentum at the WTO. So this concludes the presentation. You will find here on the slides links to further information on our respective home pages, and also where you can find the the text of the agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. I'm just jumping in. Caroline had to step out for just 1 second. But first of all, thanks a lot to all the four of you for this tour de force of presenting this very complex and comprehensive agreement in such a short amount of time. What we thought we would do is just now give the floor to a few experts who've been looking at the agreement and ask them to provide some thoughts about the significance of the agreement and how they see things unfolding. So I'll go through them very quickly, starting with Greg Messenger, who's a professor of trade law and policy at the University of Bristol. Greg, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christoph, and thanks everyone for that really interesting presentation, and thank you for all the work that's gone into all of this. Conscious of the insane amount of work that goes into negotiating things, and I don't want to be the person that says, "Oh, but what about?" So it's genuinely meant as a compliment that there's so much here that we want to do extra stuff, and really interesting. And I wanted just to say very briefly a couple of points I thought about. Reflections on the eco-labeling part, which I feel like might get a bit less attention in the press than what will happen in the future, but I think tackles one of the most fundamental challenges the whole trade regime has, which is how do governments deal with what is essentially non-governmental behavior. The problem here is not governmental standards, sort of national standards, body standards, or international standards. It's that plethora of voluntary and so on standards. And it's very interesting to take like a soft approach, contrast that with the EU's proposed Green Claims Directive, which is the other extreme, right? And I shan't make any parochial comments on that, but it's an interesting sort of contrast. There are a couple of things that struck me that were very interesting that perhaps also spoke to maybe when some of this began in terms of next steps. So couple of things I think it'd be really lovely to see the parties kind of build on. It says works really well. Having the guidelines is very clear. It ticks all the right boxes. In terms of things to build on, there are a couple of areas. The reliance on international standards, which for us, bread and butter, ideally use international standards. In some of my work interviewing, including NSB officials, some areas they're not too fussed. So I'm thinking of forestry management, where FSC and PEFC are considered relatively decent and decent enough that there isn't a sort of huge demand for an international standard. So kind of how does that fit into that framework? Some areas where there's perhaps not quite such a clear distinction between mandatory and voluntary. And I'm thinking of areas where the guidelines are very clear and the eco-labeling chapter is very clear. It doesn't apply to mandatory schemes. But then we get into that sort of tuna discussion. Well, what about voluntary standards that might help to presume compliance for mandatory schemes, and again those that could be quite important. And one thing that I would say, which is absolutely fantastic, and I say this from a standards in the public health sphere, is brilliant seeing an explicit acknowledgement that systems, and quote unquote, systems should be free from undue influence, including diverse stakeholders. So important in the environmental space, so important in general standard setting space. A lot of that at the national level usually requires very active national standards bodies to be willing to do that sort of work and able to. And so it's how to kind of sort of scale that up in this voluntary space. And then just in terms of, because I know very brief, in terms of kind of what would be like next, I'm curious to hear sort of what the thought of the next steps as discussions about WTO being open and open plurilateral. Whether or not something like the recent conformity assessment guidelines decision at the TBT committee might be a way to go for the eco-labeling guidelines. You've got something packaged up. You don't have to worry about the reduction of quality and ambition because you've agreed it. But whether there's scope for something like that would be useful kind of as a sort of multilateralizing approach to that or not. One of the questions, not to prejudge it in the panel, also in the Q&A, also just ensuring how can we find mechanisms that would build this into development projects and really incentivizing engagement with developing partners, because in the voluntary space, it can add value to products that actually would be able to be certified anyway, but need proper programs to support that. And then I'll throw in something which is very much against the tone of the guidelines, but I think actually might be quite helpful, which is have a naming and shaming mechanism. So through the national contact points, because in the end, the private actors aren't there. And what's government going to do? Government's going to go to whatever standard and say, yeah, you've got a happy, cuddly hippo on your label, and it doesn't actually do anything, and it's actually bad. And they'll go, who cares? And if there's a mechanism where the government can say, actually, we're explicitly acknowledging that we have a concern with this standard, that may well engage sort of concerns from the private actors to try and bridge that a little bit. Wouldn't have to be mandatory, but would give a bit of a hook of something in the background. But really, really interesting. I'm sure everyone wants to talk about other areas, so I'll stop there. But I just want to stop on the eco-labeling stuff. And great to see. Thank you very much. And thanks for the presentations. It was really, really helpful.
Brilliant, Greg. That was really good, and thanks also for these ideas and suggestions. We'll get back to our speakers and hopefully have an opportunity for them to answer some of these points. But let me move now to Peter Wooders, who's probably known to many of you, including for his work on fossil fuel subsidy reform. I'm sure he's going to talk about fossil fuel subsidies. Peter is co-founder and lead on renewables at the newly created Geneva Platform for Resilient Value Chains. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Christophe. Yeah, great to see so many people from the past. Vangelis, it was great to hear your introduction to the issue as well, and how many steps we went through all the way through from launching the Friends back in Paris in 2010. And I agree very much with the sentiment as well, Vangelis, that you gave, that the next step to take work forward on fossil fuel had to be a serious negotiation between countries with high climate ambition and good faith and high capacity to negotiate. And I think I very much commend that process and what really has come out of it. Before going on to fossil fuel subsidies, Carolyn mentioned at the beginning too, thinking about the context we're in now. And thinking about here on the environmental goods and the environmental services side, now we are in the middle of an urgent transition to clean energy. That's basically where we're at, and a lot of that is about the transition into renewable energy, electricity production, and then we've also got this whole critical minerals, batteries, electric vehicles chain now, which is taking so much attention of people in climate change and trade spheres. So I think just a couple of comments on the environmental goods lists. And firstly, it's good to see that all the sort of major components of solar and wind are in there, all the panels and the inverters and transformers and so on, because what we're seeing around the world is that for an awful lot of countries, they are doing pretty well on converting their electricity systems to renewables, principally solar, also with some wind, and low tariffs are very important to this. Those countries don't have really much of a stake or much of a prospect in getting, becoming major manufacturers in that sector. So, keep the tariffs low, keep it open, and it's really good to see the list here in ACTS reflects that. It will be interesting to sort of go through that list and think, when we're in this critical minerals, batteries, electric vehicles side as well, given that this is a living list, what could the 4 members at the moment of ACTS then commit to within that space? I haven't had the time to properly check all the components in there. And of course, tariffs on car imports and battery imports and so on are highly sensitive, highly political. But again, there seems to be a role for leadership here. Also very much commending the big long list of environmental services, and I think that talks very nicely to the point of, for many countries as well, looking at the clean energy transition, their prospects of gaining lots of jobs, even export sectors, rely a lot to the services you can provide within clean energy projects, all the way from original design through to commissioning, operation and maintenance, decommissioning, and so on. And the more open services can be in agreements between countries, the better the prospects are for all of us there. So that I also wanted to just note that issue too. So specifically to the fossil fuel subsidies, having looked at these issues for many years in all sorts of ways, I think this is a really good agreement on what can be done realistically between countries. Clearly, the previous ways we've had this sort of top down, we must reform all our subsidies, we must reform all our inefficient subsidies. It was just too aggregated a group, a set of subsidies to talk about. And you have to sort of confront some of the specific issues and think about which are the most harmful. Where can we allow for some exceptions that, won't take away too much of the impact of subsidy reform, but are necessary politically. And I think the agreement's done a very good job on that. Firstly, on the definition, for me, the definition of subsidies has been sort of a red herring for many, many years. And it's really good to see that this agreement just says, look, the WTO ASTM is good enough. Article 1, we'll go with that. Fantastic. It's all about benchmarks and scope anyway. The definition stuff isn't that important in my view, but it's really good to sort of knock that one on the head. It's helpful to have this idea of prohibitions and exceptions. I think we are in a world where inventories and lists are the best way to go on subsidies, looking back at the OECD's work as well. And again, the agreement does a good job on that. Nice to see the emphasis on harmful. And of course, that's a function both of the scale of particular subsidies, how big are they, and then the particular harm per dollar or per currency unit of each of those subsidies. Nice to see that coal is there explicitly prohibited. The oil and gas one's very interesting, and maybe my reading's not quite right here, but we see the oil and gas production subsidies across the whole stream are prohibited under the agreement, but then the exception is that those of them that are tax revenue foregone type measures are accepted from that. And that is the vast majority of those subsidies. If we look at typical inventories, and it'd be interesting to understand how that might be, how that quite broad exception might be tightened a bit over time, especially as we look at other agreements such as the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, who are who ban or whose members will not have new licensing rounds for oil and gas production. And then there's a big emphasis, obviously, on public finance to oil and gas production from export credit agencies and governments and others. That might be interesting to put in as well. I thought the list on exceptions was very good. It's always a possibility in these sort of agreements that you end up with so many exceptions that you end up accepting everything, and it's very easy for countries to put them in. This seems a good considered list that will allow other countries to say, well, yes, I'm worried about remote populations. I can accept that. That works well for me. The one that's always a little bit difficult to come down on which side is the right side is the exception to allow governments to support emission reduction efforts within the oil and gas industry. There's a strong school of thought here which says, well, the industry should be doing that themselves. So that's an interesting one. I thought the SCRM was very elegant. We often see that countries will say, we are heavy taxers of our heavy industrial industry, but we have to exempt them for competitive reasons and so on. And the idea of a sort of floor price of carbon here is very, very elegant. I really think that's a very good solution. And then finally, I suppose the other area that we've seen a lot of, and I know New Zealand and others have been very active within the FFSR initiative at WTO, is about the emergency response measures. So we have a very good and very nice principle here in the acts of standstill in general on subsidies, but it obviously allows that if the oil and gas price goes up very high, like it did 2-3 years ago, countries can provide some sort of temporary assistance. Within the agreement, my reading at the moment is there's no kind of limit on that. And perhaps it would be good to think about including some of the principles that are being developed within the FFSR initiative into that and sort of say, well, we understand that there are times a sort of force majeure type thing where when we don't have enough renewable generation and we don't have enough electric vehicles as a percent, we're going to have to support our vulnerable populations. What did our experience teach us in terms of targeting, in terms of sort of limiting that subsidy going forward? It'd be good to put a little bit more, I think, into that into that section as the agreement develops, with a bit more guidance on really sort of trying to make that a less open-ended exception, because it can get very expensive and very untargeted quickly. I know I've been going on too long. I also want to just one last thing. There's a very nice focus within quite a lot of the articles on just this idea of targeting, and I think that's really important, that we don't necessarily have to reform subsidies entirely, but a large fraction, a large share of them can be taken away or can be got rid of if they are just better targeted. So I thought that was very, very good. So, in summary, really, really interesting agreement, shows what can be done by a group of sophisticated countries negotiating in good faith. And congratulations to all of you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for these remarks. Just to let people know that there are questions coming in the Q&A box. Feel free to address them. We'll try to give also an opportunity to the members of the ACCTS to address them. But just look at them as they come in. Next on my list is David.
Thank you, Christophe. First, to congratulate all the membership for this landmark treaty. I think it's a very good leading by example outcome. First. Second, is a very interesting milestone to build on multilateral processes. It's not only applied on MFN basis, but also has some elements of consolidation by setting a ceiling on not raising additional duties. So I think that's the two together are a very strong message in the political will. Now, I took the time in preparing for this discussion and asking some of my developing countries colleagues what they thought about this agreement. And they gave me some tips on how to make it more palatable, more interesting for them. So I will go on some of those comments. Most of the comments follow under the environmental goods section. There are some interesting comments in fossil fuels and some interesting comments on eco-labeling. On services, there was a very positive take. So I think that's already very interesting. So on the case of environmental goods, the first thing that call attention is that among the different objectives, which are very interesting all, and we fully agree with most of them, is that there is a reference to biodiversity base, to biodiversity, sustainable use, biodiversity objectives, ecosystem protection, etc. And there is no product in the list below chapter 28 of the HS codes. I'm sorry, yes, there is almost no biodiversity-based product there, or ecosystem-based product, or natural product at all, except wood and wool too. And I'm naming to make it the case very explicit. So there is nothing below chapter 28. Second, some elements of that indicate certain interests of products. Of course, this is the list of the negotiating parties. I'm just mentioning what will be interesting. So there is almost no product linked to biodiversity-friendly products or natural products. Second point I got is that there is a reference to biomass, mainly for wood, but there is no reference, obviously, to biogas, biodiesel, or biofuels. So I'm telling you something that your colleagues will tell you in WTO very plainly. So I'm just repeating what I heard, okay? So you can guess who said the comment. The third group of comments was in relation that we found interesting. There are some non-plastic substitutes, mainly wood products, recycled paper, etc. But the list was very limited. And wool, just basically 3. We have in non-tech developed a list of more than 380 products, so that could be significantly expanded in order to make coherence in terms of the objective of addressing pollution. So you have 3 types of comments in the sense that the scope is mainly industrial products, first. Second, most developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and in Southeast Asia do not produce those products, so they told me this seems to be an import facilitation agreement in goods. I'm sorry if I'm being too frank, but I need to be frank, so you take these comments further. So if you want to make this interesting for us, you will have to make this living list very lively. Okay, so just take note of that, because they said basically there is not enough sugar in the cake to make it sweet enough for many to join. So I'm just mentioning, so think about it. That's point 1. On fossil fuel subsidies, I also took the time to talk with some oil producing countries. And this is interesting. They told me 2 things that are interesting about this. I say, what do you think about that? And in a positive stand, they told me the following, which is interesting. They were surprised that natural gas is in the list because it's considered a transitional fuel. Okay, so they say oil, fine, coal, fine, but if you also include natural gas, that you are hindering many of the transitional fuels that will be important, not only for electricity, but also for transport. Okay, point one. The second point they told me, which is interesting, they say, well, obviously this is not the type of scheme they like, but they say that the area where they will be more willing to cooperate and find a common agreement to move forward will be in standstill, notify, and cap subsidies. So just mention, and that's an interesting point, not only for fossil fuel sources, for energy, which is a chapter, but I think this is also interesting for INC plastic negotiations on subsidies to the petrochemical complex. Okay, there, and to be frank, as mentioned was Peter, most of the subsidies linked by OECD and the International Energy Agency are tax exemptions. There are very few countries that actively finance oil production and gas because it has a high markup in price, okay? And also, most of the cases, according to the WTO definition, they would not be considered subsidies because they are state-owned enterprises vertically integrated. So it's considered public investment, not money going from public to private. So they don't feel particularly threatened, just to be frank, on this, but they say the best way to go is think first of transparency and consolidation on historical terms, and they can think of going ahead with that. So I'm giving you, I think that's a very interesting message to explore with them, talk to them and see what that gets. Because that will be, at least in the ISC process, could be a deal maker more than a deal breaker. I'll go to the last point on eco-labeling. I think it's a very big effort to have it there. The comments I got, the first one is, well, you have a chapter on eco-labeling, but you have nothing on food there. So interesting points. So eco-labeling is to industrial goods or is to all goods? Obviously says goods, doesn't say industrial goods. But the first comment I got, what type of eco-labeling are you talking about? Because if it has to be a coherence between the good chapter and the soft law chapter on eco-labeling. First comment I got. The second comment, I think it was taken very positively. It was taken that this is a balanced chapter, that it also enables transparency, enables more coherence, enables less obstacles to trade. So it was taken very positively. Even then, this is a comment not by my colleagues, but by myself. I think besides the TBT, which is a track already mentioned this morning, I think you have two other three tracks that you can take to move this eco-labeling. It's soft law, which is already beautiful. In the sense that you can build consensus on that. So there are three other processes that you can take to move them forward and make proposals based on it to develop this as
David, I will have to ask you to conclude.
Okay, I'll make a quickly conclusion. Yes,
very quickly.
On eco-labeling, you have the UN Forum on Voluntary Sustainability Standards. This can be adopted at multilateral level there, and you have international standard organizations there. You can also do it in FAO, and you can also do it in UNCTAD in relation to bio trade. So you have several elements where this can be moved over with very little resistance and potentially increasing support. Thank you. Sorry to.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry, David. This was really substantive and really interesting comments. I'm just thanks a lot for that and for taking the time to go through all these things. I'm just looking at the time and just worried that we won't have enough time for other speakers. So I'll ask the next one. Please try and stick to 4 minutes so that we still have a little bit of time to get some reactions after the interventions. Next on my list is Clara.
Okay, here we go. Thanks a lot. Congratulations to everyone. This is such a big step forward. So a few words to contextualize the agreement based on our research and policy advice on trade and climate at IDOS. 5 quick points. It's key to say, first of all, that ACTS represents an agreement of ambitious front-runner countries in a way that is meant to support multilateralism. And this is important to say, right? It's a building block for an agreement, in the WTO, and it's WTO compatible. We've heard about MFN and so on. But it remains to be seen whether and how it will shape also the multilateral agenda. Our research shows that experimenting with climate-related, environmental-related provisions in the context of smaller agreements such as ACTS can help to overcome gridlock in the WTO. So this is kind of an optimistic outlook in this regard. Second of all, a few words on innovation. Let me say that something about ACTS in the context of other preferential trade agreements. based on the Trade and Environment Database Trend, with data on almost 300 different provisions in more than 700 agreements. This data has been collected by Jean-Frédéric Morin, and we've analyzed this data. And the good news, again, is that our analysis shows that many of the environmental provisions in these agreements, including climate ones, can be an effective tool to promote environmental protection and sustainability. So your endeavor was a worthwhile undertaking. It's taken a long time, but I think it will actually have an impact. This is also what our research shows. Our data shows that the average number of environmental provisions has increased over time. By now, recent trade agreements include more than 100 environmental provisions. That indicates, I think, of acts. It's not so much about the number of provisions, but their innovative character. And we've heard a lot about the innovative character in the last few minutes on fossil fuel subsidies, on eco-labeling, also on environmental goods and services. So it's the innovative nature that matters, and I think that's really commendable. And that's the basis for my third point. Our research has shown that innovation matters because new types of ideas, provisions, contents in these agreements diffuse fastly and diffuse widely across the world. So even if there are only 4 members of now to this agreement, I'm sure it will be impactful not only by having more members join over time, but also by providing inspiration and indeed templates for other negotiations going forward. This is what research suggests. Fourth point, quickly. Well, it's a sign of hope in a way. Thinking about our current times of increasing protectionism, this is, I think, precisely where part of its potential lies, to create a counterbalance, countering protectionist trends with a climate focus. And so I think it's also a big symbol in these times to have this agreement finalized now. In this context, it's also key to say that it's meant to be a living agreement, regularly reviewed and amended. And I think in terms of issues that might deserve more attention, I would suggest climate investment. Reading the agreement, it seems to me that there is more scope for shielding climate policy measures from legal challenges by providing treaty-wide exceptions in the context of investment. So that's something I at least have not seen in detail so far in this agreement. And then the last point on development, I agree that it's very interesting and important to understand what are the incentives, what is the support for developing countries to join. So to make this an agreement with many new members, I think this will be a key question. And we've just heard concrete suggestions of controversial topics where some further tweaking and expanding might be useful. Yeah, thanks so much. Overall, this is a big step forward, and I'm looking forward to seeing this unfold in the future. Congratulations again, and thanks for sharing your insights here.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Clara, for raising this point. Shuntar, you're next.
Yes, thank you very much, Christoph. And first of all, congratulations to the ACC-TESS parties for forging this agreement. On the first question on the significance of this agreement, definitely ACC-TESS is a landmark in my view. It's a dedicated agreement to forge synergies between trade and environment issues. It's legally binding, has multiple signatories, and it's holistic, not only tackling or promoting environmental goods, but looking at environmental-related services and disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies and labeling schemes. And I think it's remarkable that the door is open to other interested potential parties to join. And also it's symbolic in a way that it addresses sort of thorny issues that have emerged in the past, such as around environmental goods and services and how to go about most favored nation treatment, as well as agreeing on the identification of fossil fuel subsidies and agreeing on the identification and subject to prohibitions and exemptions with binding commitments. I think this is a very important good step. So on the way forward, I think there are 4 points that I would like to raise. The first one is that it would be interesting to see if the parties to the agreement can possibly document the implementation of the commitments to these agreements, because agreeing on an agreement is one, but the actual implementation is another. And the documentation of the implementation is actually something that is scarcely done. So It would be great if parties can possibly take something like this into consideration if this is not on the table yet. Second, perhaps it would be good to undertake empirical analysis to understand how effective this agreement is. So maybe a few years down the line, when we have more data, to see how it has an impact on promoting trade in environmental goods and services, as well as disciplining fossil fuel subsidies reforms as well. The third part on environmental goods, I think looking at the list, it seems that reflecting life cycle aspects seems to be something that continues to be a challenging area. And therefore, requirements or incentives based on carbon footprint or environmental footprint may be something that is addressed through domestic policies, and therefore addressing non-tariff measures, as well as looking into the interoperability of trade-related climate measures or environmental measures will continue to be important. And this is something that we continue to look at the OECD. Now, fourth, on the ACC-TESS as an open plurilateral, has a possibility for others to join, but I think the process itself in coming to an agreement is really valuable. So it can also be an inspiration to other agreements that would like to take a similar path. And briefings like this is very valuable. So thank you so much. And back to you, Christoph.
Thanks a lot, Shunta, for these very interesting remarks also on the implementation and next steps. Last but definitely not least, we have Alice. You have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Christoph. And thank you to TESS for putting this together. And let me add my congratulations to the ACC-TESS parties. It's great to see this agreement finally over the line. I'm conscious of time. Let me be very quick and talk about, about the importance of the framework that they've established, and then maybe a few comments, both congratulatory and maybe a little critical about sort of the content of how far they take this, but maybe with an explanation of perhaps why they got there. And like others have said, I think particularly on the fossil fuel subsidies part, the fact that they've combined a prohibition with some exceptions, with the idea of a standstill is really important. And I was fascinated to hear, David, your comment about the reaction of some oil producing countries to this idea of a standstill. I think that's a really interesting mechanism to have put in an agreement like this. I also thought as was presented earlier, this standard carbon rate of measurement idea was a really elegant way of getting past the definitional arguments that we've had, right? And I think that, so both the standstill and the SCRM, I think, are really useful sort of mechanisms to have put into treaty practice for other countries perhaps to pick up. So huge congratulations for the intellectual work that went into defining a way forward there, because I think it's a really useful contribution. As well, I think we see really useful moves forward on the environmental goods and services chapters. We had moved from kind of an APEC list of 50 or so to well over a couple of hundred on environmental goods. So that, I think, sets a really useful benchmark for where we should be going. And the idea, again, sort of reference lists on services and a clear link between environmental priorities and the services and goods that can advance them, again, is really useful sort of intellectual thinking to put into international treaty practice. So a couple of things about sort of and as people have said, sort of thinking about this as an open plurilateral, I thought it was very interesting to see in the environmental goods chapter the idea of delayed implementation of some of the tariff reductions, right? So it's a way, I think, of enabling those who might join the agreement to see that it doesn't have to be 100% on day one. If you join soon enough, right, like within the 12 years, there is some flexibility in how you stagger that tariff reduction. So that, I think, was a useful way of keeping the door open for new joiners. And I wanted to pick up, though, on a point that Peter made, particularly about some of the exclusions in the fossil fuel subsidies chapter. And this was something that got my energy policy colleagues very excited, as you could imagine, but excited from a concern perspective, right? Because there are a couple of exceptions in there, and one in particular that I think was the one Peter was talking about exceptions for tax credits for oil and gas throughout the supply chain, right? Which means including exploration and building out more production capacity. And as Peter says, tax exemptions, it's very good to have them recognized very clearly as subsidies, but they are a very big part of the fossil fuel subsidy world. including on the production side. And I think a particular concern particularly from the energy policy perspective, is that we're enabling, you set the exemption there to enable a wider group of countries to come, yes, to join the agreement. But you also there set the floor at a level where subsidies that can increase production and can be designed to increase fossil fuel production are still part of the framework, and there's still some flexibility for them. And that's, I think, a degree of concern. One other thing, so I think from our perspective, it'll be really interesting to see how the review mechanisms are used. If this is, as we saw with sort of the P4 agreement and many others, a living list and an agreement that evolves, how the review mechanism works will be extremely important, as will be how the transparency provisions are used, right? We know that the parties will be notifying each other of their fossil fuel subsidies, which is great. It would be ideal also to have some of those notifications be public, right? So that the rest of our research and civil society community can see how the agreement evolves and how members are implementing it. I think that's an important part of establishing, again, kind of as part of treaty practice, the idea that these conversations can be more public than they currently are. So I will leave it at that, Christoph.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Alice. And thank you to all the discussants for their very insightful remarks. I want to go back to our ACCTS members to give them, 1 minute. You don't all have to speak, but I think it would be good at least to give you an opportunity to react to some of these points, including those that you will have seen on the Q&A. I think a lot of them dealing with how do we make this attractive for developing countries? What mechanisms, flexibilities are there? A couple of questions also about prospects for new members that you may want to address, and of course any point that has been raised by our discussants. Who wants to start? Anna. There was also one specifically on Costa Rica, as you may have seen.
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. I'll try to be super brief because I want to address some of the questions that are in the chat, and I already tried to answer one. But first, also thank the panelists for their insights. I think it is very important to remember what this agreement is about. So this is an agreement that actually is trying to facilitate the access to different goods and different technologies to reduce the climate change impacts. It's not a preferential agreement. So here we need to understand the nature of the agreement itself. Why is this agreement attractive to a developing country like Costa Rica? Why are also the only developing party in the agreement? Well, because we believe that this is an agreement that can strengthen and expand our skills in terms of trade, in terms of sustainability, in terms of attracting foreign direct investment that is sustainable, that is productive, that enhances our competitiveness in these sectors. So for us, it's an agreement that will facilitate also the access to green technologies that will help us reduce these impacts of climate change. So this is an important element to mention. For other developing countries, that access to technologies is fundamental, and strengthening that capacity to attract FDI that is sustainable, that is green, that enhances their participation in global value chains, and that increases and improves the domestic linkages, productive linkages, is also very, very important in terms of leapfrogging to greener economies. Then also with regards to Costa Rica's challenges, well, we were very thorough in terms of consultations domestically with the different sectors, and we did not find any kind of sensitivities either for the goods or the services part of this negotiation. Actually, what we saw was opportunities for this, as I mentioned, this attraction of sustainable and green FDI. So for us, it is actually like a platform to enhance our participation in global value chains and green value chains. In terms of maybe the most immediate challenges, like a speedy, a swift approval of the agreement in Congress, but we hope that we can have this done in the next year or by the latest, because the idea is to have this agreement entering into force late 2025 or early 2026. And let me see if there is any new question for Costa Rica, but basically for developing countries, I think it is an attractive opportunity to strengthen their participation internationally for trade and sustainability in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Anna. That was great. Michel, Thomas, Ugmundur, who wants to go first?
Yes, I can go through some of the questions, but first let me thank for all these really interesting and really useful comments to this agreement. Also with regard for the perspective, how to develop it further. Of course, we are now still in the process of ratifying, and we have had not so much time to reflect on the next steps afterwards when it's entered into force, but that's really helpful, and thank you very much. Regarding the attractiveness for developing countries, of course, this is important, and the agreement recognizes the challenges of developing countries also in context of climate change, and it includes provisions, be it in the exceptions or in other parts of the agreement that acknowledge these challenges and include provisions that favor also the participation of developing country in this agreement. Regarding new members, what we hear is there is a lot of interest now from other countries to understand the agreement, and we will then see how this translates then in real interest to accede to the agreement. Now a bit on more specific points. Yes, there is an exception, a carve out of the revenue foregone subsidies in the production sector of the fossil fuel production. It is important. It was important in the negotiations, and we understood that we need more time to achieve a result in this part. Of course, in the production sector, you have also a lot of taxes, so there is a lot of revenue for governments from the production of these fuels. But it seems to be that there are also subsidies, and we need more time to better understand and to find a good solution on that. Then a word on there was a question on the transition. So natural gas as a transition to a cleaner economy. That depends a bit on the ambition of the individual countries, where the countries are, in what stage of the countries are in this transition. But there is a specific exception that allows for a time-limited period to use subsidies for generation of electricity, for example, to bridge the two stages from fossil fuels to a renewable economy. On eco-labeling, it includes all goods, so it's also eco-labels on food that we know they're very widely used here in Switzerland as well. So this eco-labeling chapter applies to all goods. Thank you all very much for this context on that we heard from several speakers on this chapter. That's very interesting and certainly something that can be further developed. I stop here, and we will be happy to answer any questions also by other means. Please contact us if you have questions or if we can engage on these topics. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, excellent. Michel.
Thank you, Christoph. And very briefly, because I'm aware of time, just want to say thank you for all the insightful comments and questions. We obviously can't hope to do justice to all of those in brief concluding remarks. So as Thomas has just extended, very open to further discussion and further questions. Just to pick up very briefly on 3 points. Thank you. It's been very heartening to hear the recognition generally of the value of this agreement as a pathfinder, as a practical step forward. I think as the parties have underlined, we see a couple of ways in which the agreement can serve that pathfinder function. Obviously, keen to have other parties join us in due course once the agreement enters into force, but also for the work that's been done in the agreement to seed ideas and to help us advance ideas in our work in the WTO, in the OECD, in other fora where we are working to advance these issues. So it's not just about joining, but it's also about planting ideas and helping them to grow in other fora. And in that context, very well taken. My last 2 points, very well taken about the points about effective implementation and being very conscious of how we use the implementation to grow support and to grow the value of the agreement, and similarly the review provisions, how those are used to grow the value of the agreement and to grow support for it. So thank you, everyone. Very useful discussion.
Thank you. Ögmundur, do you want to add something?
No, nothing to add. Just thank you for all of the speakers and all of the inputs that we got. It was like Michelle, it was heartwarming to hear the support and the recognition of the agreement. So thank you so much.
Thanks a million. And let me maybe ask Caroline to give us any kind of concluding thoughts.
Well, firstly, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's really been such a pleasure to be able to work with New Zealand, Costa Rica, Iceland, and Switzerland on hosting this event today. Thank you also, Christoph, for moderating. I know we're over time, so I would just close by saying I think everyone who has joined the call today is very grateful to the 4 countries for having taken forward this effort. They're trying to put something concrete, practical on the table as a Pathfinder initiative, both, as you have indicated, Michelle, for others to join, but also to seed the very important wider discussions that we need to be having. And so I really wanted to thank also the experts who joined us today, Greg, Peter, David, Clara, Shunta, and Alice. All of you in different ways are playing leadership roles in this wider issue of how do we enhance international cooperation on trade and climate. And so it's been so useful to hear your very substantive reflections on what's significant about this agreement, giving it, the credit where it's due, where are things that could be improved, where do you have questions of potential things that could be developed further, particularly in terms of making it appealing for developing countries. But I think you've also stepped back and highlighted places and processes through which many of these ideas in the agreement can be taken forward. And that's really what we want to see, to generate action and cooperation in a range of different processes and helping people to use this as an inspiration for further cooperation on trade and climate. So I think we can stop there for today, but I really want to thank you all for taking the time. We will make this available by video afterwards for those who weren't able to join today, and really hope that we can continue to engage all of you in this conversation. And thank you again to the 4 ACTS signatories for taking this forward and allowing us to have this conversation about paths forward as well today. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day.